So I want to start off by just thanking everyone for joining us for today's conversation with Geoffrey West. I feel like most of the people on this call already know Geoffrey, but he is the distinguished Shannon Professor at the Santa Fe Institute and a past president of the Institute. He's received a shopping list of academic awards, and one of the ones I think is most notable, he was once, Time Magazine once named him as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He's played a foundational role in the fields of urban scaling and the science of cities. I'm going to turn it over to Geoffrey so we can get started, but just a couple of notes on process before I do. There is going to be some technical material in Geoffrey's talk today. If you have technical questions during the talk, please enter that into the chat function. If you have discussion questions, we're going to ask that you wait until the end of the talk, and Geoffrey's promised that we are going to save some time at the end for more of a general discussion. As with these past conversations, for those general discussions, either enter into the chat that you have a question or use the raise hand feature under the participants sort of option within Zoom. But maybe with that as sort of a technical prologue, let me turn this over now to Geoffrey West. Geoffrey, thank you.
I just unmuted. Hi, everybody. I also got a message that said my internet is unstable, so I hope it actually holds up during this meeting. I apologize. I was going to say it's great to be here because I'm at home. This is the first of time I've given a Zoom talk. I've done quite a few podcasts and interviews and obviously lots of meetings. So I'm slightly intimidated, and I'm finding it extremely difficult to just sit in my dining room actually and be trying to give a lecture to people I can't see, but hopefully it will all work. So let's see. So this is this is trying to bring together some of the work that we developed on understanding cities and leading into some questions about sustainability and so forth, social networks, the role of networks. With what's going on right now in terms of the pandemic. And in so doing, I have 2 points I want to make. One is I have to give some background material, which means that even though, as Will mentioned, many of you probably have heard some of the talks I've given in the past, you will see some tired old slides, I'm afraid, as I repeat some of the background in order to give a context for looking into some of these questions of the pandemic. Secondly, I'm not an epidemiologist, and so I'm venturing into territory for which I do not have a background, but I do want to bring to it a slightly different viewpoint, and as I say, relate it to the context of city and social networks. So with that said, let me try to begin the talk by sharing screen. And let me see if I can find, there's the talk. Share. Can everybody see that? This is the...
Yeah, we can see all the slides.
Good, good. So that's the title of what it's worth. And first, let me remind you, and really this is the driving point, is that the pandemics, like many things in our world, are really in our socioeconomic world anyway, is an urban phenomenon, basically. And that's where all the action was taking place and is taking place. And that's what got me interested in just trying to put all these things together. So just to remind us that the whole fate of our planet, in terms of everything that goes on, is completely integrated and bound up with cities. And that's why some of us are working on some of these questions in terms of developing, for want of a better phrase, a science of cities. But to remind you that cities are really the stage for social interaction. I mean, it's this incredible machine that we invented in order for us to interact, to form networks, to transmit ideas and disease. create wealth, improve standards of quality of life, and so forth. So it's where all the action is. And it's these kinds of images that one should have in mind, this integration between social networking, that is people, and the infrastructure. And the infrastructure should be seen as the stage for facilitating the socioeconomic ideas. So to just put that in words, it's this amazing machine that we have created for creating wealth, improve standards of quality of life, make more knowledge, innovate new ideas, etc., etc. But of course, there's all kinds of unintended consequences, because the machine also creates inequality, it creates pollution, crime, and of course, disease and pandemics and social unrest. And I just want to make a remark here that these two slides may look sort of very recent in a certain sense, but in fact, they've been part of talks I've given for the last probably 5 to 10 years, actually, because one of the things that I've tried to sort of emphasize is that the very dynamic of cities invites more disease, more pandemics, the possibility of more pandemics, and of social unrest. And it's been very sad to see what's happened in the last several months, this coming, so to speak, to fruition. So one of the big questions is, going back to these pictures, these pictures here of what the city is doing and what the city is for. One of the big questions following the pandemic is, can we do it with this, what we're doing now? And maybe that's something we can leave to the discussion. But, this is, compared to those pictures we saw before, this is totally soulless, it's two-dimensional, it's incredibly limiting, and yet it's going to be stuff of the future. And the question is, how much of the stuff of the future and how much of the way social networks develop is connected to this, I think is a huge question, and one that maybe we can get into a little bit later. So the way we typically deal with all our problems that occur in cities and occur in socioeconomic life is, of course, we put boxes around all these various things, and we deconstruct them into various individual components. And in fact, we don't only do that, we put boxes around things within boxes, and we put then boxes within those boxes, and so on. And that's been enormously successful. But of course, one of the things that we have learned, and why the Santa Fe Institute exists, is that we have learned, in fact, all of these interdependent on one another. Interrelating is a complex adaptive system of complex adaptive systems. And I just flashed this laundry list on of various characteristics of complex adaptive systems. We're not going to dwell on this. Many of you are familiar with some of these ideas, but they're all the sort of buzzwords that we associate with complexity and are associated quintessentially with cities. But given that interconnectivity, and in particular, some of the emergent behaviors that we know come in complex systems, the sensitivity to change, the interrelatedness, we should not have been surprised that a random mutation of a virus in a city in China results in no football in Spain, bankruptcy of Hertz, the shortage of yeast, social unrest in France, etc., etc., etc. And, whoops, my machine seems to have stopped. And of course, all that is related to exponential sensitivity. And what we're going through now is the mother of all butterfly effects. Something small happening somewhere having an enormous impact in areas that you would not have expected, and with exponential enhancement. Now, if you don't do that, if you do always focus only on the particular and on the individual, this is the problem you run into. This is just a silly cartoon illustrating the point. And here's a typical example. This is what we typically do. We focus on one problem, solve it, and then surprised that, of course, a little bit later the problem returns in some other form. So that's what we have to avoid and understand. So as I said, cities are quintessentially complex adaptive systems, and that means they are the integration of energy and resources, metabolism, the physicality of the city, the infrastructure, with information exchange, which leads to innovation and wealth. And that, of course, is embodied in social networks. And networks play, obviously, a fundamental role in all complex systems, but particularly in cities, and in particular in fueling the pandemic. So cities are, of course, networks. They're infrastructural networks, and they look not so dissimilar from the networks that are keeping you alive inside your body. That's who you are. You're a bunch of networks. There's neural networks, there's your lungs, trees, and so on. And some of you may be familiar the work that I've been involved in the past using this idea to show that there is an extraordinary universality across biological and ecological phenomena that can be expressed through scaling laws, as well as through the network properties that we see here. And so one can take those ideas, which I will not dwell on, to apply it to at least the analogous biological part of cities, the infrastructure, and derive ideas of scaling laws for them. And here's a very mundane one: number of gas stations versus size of a city. And you see there's very systematic scaling. And the remarkable thing is that this kind of scaling propagates through all infrastructure. But not only that, the slope of that line is about 0.85, a little bit less than 1. The dotted line is linear, meaning if you double the size of a city, you would have twice the number of gas stations, twice the number of length of the roads, twice, et cetera, et cetera. But what it says is, in fact, you save 15%, roughly speaking, with every doubling. So there's an extraordinary economy of scale, and this is called sublinear scaling. And that's great, but more important to a city, in a way, even though we always think of it as infrastructural, is social networks. And you're very familiar with those. And this is a typical social network with nodes and links. But the part I want to emphasize, and the part that is rarely discussed by network scientists, is the fact that networks have two properties. One they do discuss is the modularity, namely that we form groups, but also that we have to be in a place. So even when you're doing Zoom calls all over the world, and I believe there are people from Singapore on this, hello to my Singapore friends if you are, you have to be someplace. Even though we're all on the same screen, you have to be in some place. And what that means is that you have to be supported by food and transport and so on and so forth. So you're integral to the infrastructure, even though you may think you're in some cloud version of a social network. So these two things are intimately intertwined and integrated, namely social networks and infrastructural networks. And I just sort of a little cartoon version of it here. So the fundamental property of a social network that differs from almost all other kinds of networks that we're familiar with is that it has positive feedback in it. That is, the fact that we talk to one another, A talks to B, B to C, C to D, D back to A. And in that process, which is what the city is doing, is facilitating, that process leads to more things being developed. That is, more ideas, more wealth, and so on. And that is the origin of something called superlinear scaling, namely, the bigger you are, instead of the less per capita, you get more per capita. And another thing that happens as a result of that is that you increase the pace of life. And here's some just a panel of graphs showing that of a bunch of different characteristics of a city in different parts of the world, all showing similar scaling. And the remarkable thing is, not only do they scale, reflecting the structure and dynamics of social networks, but they're the same regardless of the metric and regardless of where you are in the world, and they all manifest a slope of, roughly speaking, 1.15, meaning with every doubling, very roughly, you get 15% more per capita rather than less per capita. So just to put it into English, on average, doubling the size, very roughly, saves about 15% on infrastructure and increases all socioeconomic things, income, wealth, the good, bad, and the ugly, crime, social interactions, flu, and of course, COVID-19. All by about 15%. And that has been tested, and I'll come back to this in a moment, these laws have been tested by using mobile phone data to measure the degree of interaction and connection between people. And of course, that underlying theory, that conceptual framework would say that since these are manifestations of social interactions, if we measure social interactions, it should just look like one of these graphs, these straight lines, and indeed it does. So, the way we interact, of course, is primarily, not always, but two-body interactions. So I'm going to assume that, and that all of these characteristics, which I call Y as a function of the population N, are proportional to the number of social interactions. Now, if everybody interacted with everybody else, there's one of me, and there's N of others, so there's N minus one of others. The number of social interactions would be N, that's the number of people, times the number of interactions each person could have had, which is N minus one. So it goes approximately as N squared, which is certainly superlinear, but of course that's nuts. We don't interact with everybody else. And in fact, it is the social network and the infrastructural networks that keep us constrained, both in our social life and in our physical life. And that is what leads to the number of interactions going in this 15%. And I've written it here in this mathematical form as a power law with an exponent of 1.15. And all that means in English is what I said before. But that also means that for the average individual, the number of interactions increases relatively slowly so I divide by N, this is per capita, increases 0.15. Anyway, this is what is sort of the origin of why all those scaling laws have this slope of about 1.15. And the point is that 1.15 is not N squared, and you don't interact with N, roughly approximately N other individuals, you get constrained. And that's going to be very important. Now I'm going to move into epidemiology. And as I say, I'm not an expert. So I'm wandering into new territory, and this is standard stuff. This was developed a long time ago, and this is the basis for all of the analyses and estimates and so on that you see in the press, and that professional epidemiologists are working their butts off to try to get a good idea as to what's happening. But I want to give you just the bare bones of it, the skeleton of it, and apply it to what they have not applied it to, and that is restricting it due to the constraints of social and infrastructural networks of cities. And I considered that important and worth investigating simply because that is where the action is taking place, namely in urban environments. So here it is. So I'm going to develop this, and you'll excuse me for presenting it in a slightly technical form, but I felt it was important. So N is the total number of population. Now, it needn't be a city, by the way, and here's a point. It's a social group, and it needn't be the transmission of viruses, as I put up there. This you could think of, in fact, I like to think of it, as the transmission of ideas, because that's mostly what we do when we interact. Most of the ideas are crappy, but that is the way we interact, by exchanging, I will call them ideas. So let's call I the number of people who get the idea, whatever that is, at some time t. S is the number who haven't yet got it, and we're called susceptible. They haven't got the disease or they haven't got the idea. And R is the number who recover if it's a disease, but reject the idea if they don't believe that they should be supporting Make America Great Again. They would be R. Okay. So obviously, so I've assumed that population is contained of these different types. So the total population of the group, the city, the country, whatever it is just the sum of those. So what is the rate at which these ideas of viruses spread? Well, it's clearly, and just the first going off, is proportional to the number of interactions between those who already have it, the I's, who already have the disease or the idea, and those that they're talking to, the number of people that are susceptible. So here's the equation that expresses that. Di dt, the rate at which ideas or infections spread, the number, is proportional to, F is the proportionality constant, which is basically, for the purposes of this, the efficiency of transmission, or the probability of transmission between individuals, the number of those that have it, get the idea, I, and those that are susceptible, very simple. And this has sort of been the basis of of what has been developed in epidemiology. But we just saw that this can't be right because you don't, I mean, at least from the urban viewpoint, because you don't interact. Each individual doesn't interact with every single person that is susceptible. And we just learned from the city work that gets restricted because it's to not being linear in S, but going like a power law in S with a coefficient of about 0.015. I call it beta, just to keep it general. So this is the sort of the beginning equation, but of course, we have to adjust for those that are rejecting the idea or those that are recovering. And that's what I put in here. There's a minus sign in front of those, the number that are rejected. And that symbol nu, I would call the rejection or recovery rate. And it's roughly speaking, for a disease, it's roughly the duration of the infection. So nu, the inverse of it is the duration of the infection. So here's the fundamental equation. And except for the beta being there, it's what is the sort of epidemiological graduate students learn when they start out. So in the earlier stages, the S here, going back to that equation, the S, there we are, the S, the number of susceptibles dominates. And so just to make it simple, S, and certainly for a disease, the number of susceptibles is sort of the entire population. So this equation reduces to something extremely simple. If I define G, that little G there, as going back here to F times this to the beta, but now I'm replacing this by N, then we have this simple equation. And what you see is that if G and nu are constant, which they typically are, then the rate of increase of I is proportional, the rate of increase of the infected, or those that get the idea, is proportional to those who already have it. And that is, of course, an exponential. So the solution to that is a simple exponential whose growth is determined by the difference between G and nu, between social interactions and between those that are recovering or rejecting. And of course, whether it grows or contracts depend upon whether one is bigger than the other. And this is usually expressed, and this is where you hear it, in terms of this quantity R0, the famous R0 that you hear about. And in this terminology, it's just little g over nu. And you can see if R0, look at that equation here. My cursor will do it here. If R0 is bigger than 1, it grows. If R0 is less than 1, it decreases. So this is sort of the fundamentals of epidemiology. The only new thing is that we now have a prediction for how it should change with the size of the group, if there is a reasonably well-defined group, like a city. Well, this is data from the beginning of the virus, and you've seen these, of the pandemic. And indeed, I should have said, one of the things that if it's an exponential like this, a simple exponential, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that if you plot it on the vertical axis as the logarithm of the number infected, So he goes up, look at this here, they go up by factors of 10, 100, 1,000. Against time here, you should get a straight line if it's exponential. And indeed, at the beginning, we see these nice straight lines for various, for the total country, for California, and so forth. So this is the straightforward stuff. Now, in typical pandemics in the past, or epidemics anyway, G and U are fixed. I mean, you don't, when we have influenza, the social networks don't change, basically. And certainly recovery rates are biomedically determined. If they're, what I've assumed is constant, and that's what's normally done. However, it also tells you, what we also know, is you can mitigate, either enhance or suppress the number infected. Now, for disease, for pandemics, you'd like to suppress the I's, but for ideas, you'd like to enhance the I's. So even though the equation's basically the same, you have two different functions here. So for example, for viruses, you can, if you increase, you want to decrease G, you want to decrease social connectivity, and that's physical distancing. Obviously, it makes no bloody difference if you social distance and you're on the web. It's physical distancing that you need to do. On the other hand, if you want to increase ideas, you want to increase social closeness for ideas. So G goes up for ideas, you want it down for viruses. And similarly, nu, the only way to change it for viruses if you make some biomedical breakthrough, which hopefully we will, and ultimately we will produce a vaccine. But of course, we have the opposite again for ideas. You want to decrease the rejection, the number of the rejectors, and I call that propaganda. You need to convince them in different ways to decrease, or you might even decrease it so much so that you can make nu negative, so that as you increase the number of people who get the idea, the number who reject exponentially decrease. So this is all exponentially sensitive, and that means that two things. One is it's prone to the possibility of a chaotic phenomenon, a butterfly effect, which we mentioned earlier. Secondly, it means that it's extremely difficult to make accurate predictions, and that's the problem epidemiologists are challenged by. But now we want to go into this mode where we are able to manipulate, that we change. When we go back here to this equation, we allow G and U to change, which means when we go back to this equation and we solve it, it's not simply any longer a simple exponential. So here's what it is. You can write it as an exponential, but it tells you something interesting that you sort of intuitively know, contrary to what is being said, you know, that if you measure R naught now, you know whether it's increasing or decreasing. If you are changing social distancing or changing the biomedical atmosphere, then you have to integrate over the history of what the distancing was, what the social network was. So you have to integrate over it, so it depends upon the history and the past. So the instantaneous measure of R naught does not necessarily tell you whether the pandemic is increasing or decreasing. So here's some social distancing. This is the same methodology I mentioned when I said we tested the theory using mobile phone data, and I'm sure some of you have seen this. And what it is, it's the difference in encounter density of people as a function of time. You see the date, it's slightly obscured at the bottom there, but from the beginning, and you can see the 0 here is what it would be for the entire country, what social distancing was before the whole thing began for the entire country. And you can see California was 50% above anyway to begin with, and then it went down to, as a whole, down to maybe 70, 80%. And you can see different cities, and this is Los Angeles. But you see it's a varying function, and you can see in Los Angeles' case, it's been going up for a while, actually. And here is San Francisco, and you can see it went low and it stayed low. And that is no doubt one reason why San Francisco is doing much better than Los Angeles in dealing with it. But the point of this also is that this you feed into, these graphs, you feed into this equation, basically. That's the thing you have to integrate over. And in a certain sense, the development of the pandemic is a simple reflection of this graph. Okay. So there's the entire US. And of course, that gives rise to this bending over that you're very familiar with.
Geoffrey, the 30-minute mark, just to let you know.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'll finish off relatively quickly. Now, it turns out that you can take those equations and you can determine a solution for the total number of infected at the end of the whole process when the thing is finished. And you can show that that scales, and not surprisingly, with this 1.15. Remember, beta is 0.15. So if only a minority of people are infected, which is the case, the bigger cities are going to have substantially more than smaller cities, and the rate at which they get them, which is to a large extent determined by the social interaction G, that's from the social network, increases slowly, is just to the exponent 0.15, but increases with the size of cities. So here's an example that I've given here. A city of 10 million will double the number of cases in half the time a city of 100,000 will, and have 200 times as many such cases. And that's because a city of 10 million is 100 times, if I did my arithmetic right, is 100 times bigger than a city of 100,000. So this is sort of New York to Santa Fe, roughly. And if you take that factor of 100 and you put it in here, you make n 100, and you take the 0.15 power of it, it turns out that is 1.9995, 2. And that's why this result follows from it. And it's sort of roughly correct. Now, it turns out, it's sort of interesting that if you have a pandemic that's a true pandemic, I guess, that sort of everybody, large, huge numbers get infected, as was in the 1918 flu, then this result for the superlinear behavior of the total number actually goes linear. So there's very little data on this. This is data was put together in March when the thing began by my colleague, Luis Betancourt, to see whether you could see the scaling. And it was way too early, I think. There's too many fluctuations, too many things happening, but that was their attempt to do it. I don't think they've actually done the arithmetic right either, the calculation right either, but it doesn't matter. It was a very interesting attempt, I think. But that's showing that increase of the rate in which you get it as a function of population size. But here I got some data on the flu cases in the US during the 100 years ago. And here what you see is, I didn't put the caption in, but the authors say that this is all consistent except for 1918 with a slope of 1 being linear, which would be in agreement with that prediction, because this is a case where enormous numbers of people got it compared to the number of people that have got the present pandemic. So let me finish off with a couple of very quick, how can I take just a few more minutes, Will?
Yeah, please, absolutely.
I just want to remind people of some of the previous work on growth, because growth is sort of related to this. And growth works by your social metabolic rate. Everything that goes into socioeconomic productivity gets apportioned, roughly speaking, between maintenance and new growth. And that gives rise to super exponential unbounded growth, because the social networks giving rise to superlinear behavior. Superlinear behavior gives rise to unbounded growth, unlike for us. Sublinear behavior gives rise, sublinear scaling gives rise to bounded growth. That's why we stop growing. This is why economies keep growing, is that, but that has built into it this finite time singularity, and that's just data showing that, but the finite time singularity, which leads to stagnation and collapse. And to avoid it, this is old work that we did, old work was showed that in order to avoid it, you have to continually reinvent yourself. And that's what this is. That requires reinvention in order to avoid the collapse associated with the singularity that's built into the equations. And the thing I want to get to here is that that's great. That's what we've done. This is the idea that innovation gets us out of trouble and will get us out of trouble, and that you have to reinvent yourself in a cyclical way. However, the thing that's been missing is that you have to do it faster and faster. Life accelerates, and here's data supporting it. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but here's the point, that the unbounded growth of leading to finite singularity requires faster and faster innovation. But that's an example of everything in socioeconomic life getting faster and faster, and the need to adapt faster and faster. And one of the great potential crises we're facing is that this acceleration of socioeconomic life, which, by the way, is of itself accelerated by a discontinuity such as an industrial revolution, a world war, a financial collapse, or what we're going through now, a pandemic. Things that were there get accelerated faster and faster. But the problem we're facing is the people that are dealing with it have the same brains and the same biology you had 100,000 years ago. And that's an issue. And we can feel it now. We feel that the advent of Zoom, the advent of the internet, advent of social media has speeded up everything. And the question is, how does that reflect itself on cities? And the question is, to what extent is that sustainable? I think I will finish there. I won't go into its companies and so on. I think that's a good place to stop. So let me go back to that. And I'll finish there. And maybe we can have some discussion.
That was outstanding. Thank you, Geoffrey. Applause does not work well over Zoom, as you know, but I assure you we would all be clapping if we could make applause work over Zoom. I do want to transition into taking some questions, as Geoffrey said. For those of you who've done this before, you're familiar, there is a button on the bottom of your Zoom screen called Participants with the number 48 next to it. If you click on that, you'll get a sidebar that will allow you to use a function that says raise hand. If you raise your hand, I'll know that you have a question for Geoffrey, and we can turn your audio on and your video on, and you can sort of go ahead and ask it. If you're struggling to use that functionality, because I know some of us are less familiar with Zoom than others, you can always just send me a chat message as well, if that's easier for you. So Geoffrey, while people are sort of working to figure that out, let me take advantage of having the microphone and ask you a question following up on some of the discussion that we had yesterday. Typically when you'd show these equations before, I think everyone always thought of N as simply the population of whichever city we're looking at. But you made a really interesting point in showing Zoom at the beginning, and for some of these transmissions, particularly for ideas as opposed to viruses, for those of us who are spending 5 hours a day on Zoom, it feels like maybe the N shouldn't be the population of our city, but that social network that we're interacting with, through digital media. Are you now starting to think of N as having, different sizes for different types of transmissions, or should we still be thinking of it as the population of whatever city we're in?
Well, I should say, when all the way through this work, actually from the beginning, I never thought of, I realized that this could be everything that has been developed applies to a group which has some kind of cohesion, some kind of identity, and some kind of boundary. And the city, of course, is a prime example of that. It has, we have a kind of well-defined idea as to what a city is. We have less well-defined ideas, and for cities or institutions in general, universities and so forth. So we can form the idea of community. And indeed, we can define community by actually, if we can analyze the network, whatever the network is, and see that there is actually some boundary where there's a finite number of people interacting within that network, and that defines it. Then some of these ideas, especially that transmission ideas, could potentially apply to it, as could the ideas of the scaling laws. And one of the things that we have been involved in, as you know, is trying to take these ideas to companies and to universities, actually, and which are well-defined communities. So to see what their scaling laws, what are the properties of their networks, how does that determine their growth function, their mortality. I mean, lots of things I didn't talk about here, obviously, their mortality, and a lot of it, and how do you feed into that functionality.
Great. Thank you, Geoffrey. We have another question from Josh Wolf.
Hey, Geoffrey, been thinking a lot about the superlinear scaling and, being a New York City resident, all of the pros of the density of the city, and then of course the risks. Certain neighborhoods have been hit especially hard.
Yeah.
What do some of the models inform us about the resilience in the presence of an exogenous shock, of the ability for a city that disperses its core constituents spread out into the suburbs? The sort of time frames, the recongealing of a disrupted system from an exogenous shock.
Yeah, that's of course a huge question, and one that we've started to look at a little bit. A large problem with it is getting data that's relevant to that, because you just use the word suburb, and people talk about neighborhoods and so on. But to do this work, you've got to have an operational definition and data that supports it. I had a slide actually here on that's sort of related to your question. That is, we tried to look at deconstructing the scaling law for a city into income groups, into deciles, and to see, if you just look at individual deciles, how do they scale? And I won't bring up the graph, but I'll just tell you that it's sort of what you expect, that even though the average might be 1.15, if you're in the lower deciles, if you're in the bottom 10 or 20% decile, it's linear, which sort of means it's irrelevant that you're in the city. I mean, you're not gaining from being in the city in that sense. As you go up, you get to the 10% decile, it's like 1.25. Not only are you super linear, you're kind of super linear. You're more linear than the average. And so, this was an attempt to start to deconstruct that and to relate it then to place, to physical, the questions of suburbs and what we used to call slums, but anyway, areas that are, struggling financially and socioeconomically. And it's extremely difficult to get the data. You look at things like, it would be great to get lots of Facebook data and Twitter data and so on, but you've got to correlate that with, characteristics of people. But the answer to your question, I can't answer, because we don't know, other than what we do know is that cities per se are extraordinarily resilient. That is, that even though you perturb them significantly, even, they are incredibly adaptable. I mean, they're a phenomenal complex adaptive system. They're adaptable.
I had one thought, sorry to interrupt, which I wonder if analogously there might be anything, but in thinking about your sort of end effectors and the fractal nature of like capillaries from larger circulatory systems, and then sort of the end effectors and units inside of a city, and thinking about like, you know, a cut to the body and how the immune system reacts and then recongeals and scar tissue and all the sort of metaphors of that, in thinking about like a segment of the city that effectively gets, you know, a big cut and, you know, it disperses and then recongeals. And if there's something that we might learn from, you know, how our healing system in the body reacted to the way a city might, you know, proverbially heal.
Well, I think it's quite analogous in that sense. I mean, if you keep it at the level of cuts and even broken bones, cities are extremely good. I mean, cities are much better than us because, as I often point out, we did this terrible experiment. We dropped atom bombs on cities, and 25 years later, they're functioning. I mean, it's sort of extraordinary. But, you know, I hate to say it in the context, but you get a bullet in your body almost anywhere, you know, you're liable to die. Cities are much more resilient than the individuals. And cities do, I mean, and that resilience gets sort of reflected in their, I'll use the word immortality, but that's of course an open question, but apparent immortality, you know, they just keep going. And not only keep going, they often keep growing. Whereas all the individuals in it, all the individuals that make up the city are gone. You know, they get replaced. All the individual pieces get replaced. And it's a bit like the image of your, you know, your skin cells, which are continually replacing. And so this is built into the system somehow. And but you bring up a critical question, which is, you know, ecologists, of course, look at these questions in terms of, you know, forests that get, you know, an event happens, a fire, or they get cut down, and so on. And so there's a lot of work in ecology that's related to this, but very, very little that I'm familiar with cities. I mean, we had a proposal years ago to do this, and we were going to look at, you know, the obvious ones: Detroit, New Orleans, and another city that wasn't. I forget which one. But that was was exactly this idea: can we use this framework? And the important point here, by the way, is that I think you have to have a framework like this. You have to have, quote, a quantitative science in order to begin to answer that question. If you don't know what the baseline is, if you don't know what it is that's leading to, you know, the healthy city, so to speak, how are you going to determine what's the disease? In the same way that we have an image of what a healthy human being is, we know what a heart rate should be, we know what a temperature should be, we know various metrics that define a healthy human being. And you need those, and you need to understand the dynamics of those, where they come from, in order to say, you know, if you got a temperature of 110, you're in trouble. You know, so it's that kind of thing. But we're at a loss, I think I would say, still at the moment in cities. Yeah.
So Geoffrey, we have another question from Catherine Collins. Catherine?
Great. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Hey, hi, Catherine.
Good. Hi, Geoffrey. Thanks for doing this. I'm struck by your last comments in particular about the constraints of humanity, right, in keeping up with the ever-increasing pace of innovation that's needed. And I'm wondering if you could connect that to your comments about pollination of ideas and the uptake of ideas. And I'm trying to think about, you know, what the bridges are between the acceleration of our physical infrastructure and technologies and the potential acceleration of us to deal with them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I just noticed the chat that Matt Hoffman from Sandia wrote. So I'm just glancing at a similar question. And I find it fascinating, this issue. And I'm fascinated more, first of all, by our success, meaning our adaptability. I find it still amazing that, I know there's this, I'll make it extremely personal. I'm 80 this year, and I find it extraordinary about myself that I can do this, that I was able to get onto Zoom, click share. I know it's trivial. It's all trivial.
No, it's
but
monumental.
it's another magic thing. It's another thing I have to learn and do, and it's continuing like that. It's all these things where I think, Jesus Christ, I've at last mastered how to do Dropbox, and then they tell me, no, you got to do something else. My colleagues, and it's sort of like that. And I'm so first of all, I'm extraordinarily impressed by our adaptability to these things and to this increasing pace. The fact that I see little old ladies with their iPhone in supermarkets talking to someone and doing a list of things. I mean, it's amazing. So, and we've been able to do that. We've been able to adapt extraordinarily. And really the question is, the two questions are, is this acceleration going to go on? I mean, that's what, and from work I've described, we sort of need to. It's sort of like this need. The thing will collapse without it is sort of the image. That may well be wrong, but I believe that to be correct, and that's been our history. But then it brings up this question, what are the limits to our adaptability? Are there limits to the adaptability of our neural system, let alone the rest of our biology, to being able to keep all this in one place? And I have been amazed, as I'm sure many of you are. I was absolutely thrilled, I hate to admit this, the first couple of weeks of the pandemic when SFI closed down and I was at home all the time. I thought, my God, I can catch up with so many things. I'm doing so many things. And quickly, Zoom and Facebook and Skype just took over my life. More and more things happened. And the amazing thing is, with more and more time on my hands, apparently, I'm accomplishing less and less. And that's sort of and at first I put that down to the fact that I'm nearly 80, but I had learned that from some of my young colleagues, that they feel somewhat similar. So it's an interesting question, and I do not know the answer, but it's one I pose. So, I'm more concerned, about the other end, that, that we're not going to be able to continue this acceleration of major paradigm shifts and what that's leading to. And I think we happen to live at a critical point in that. And I do believe that in that sense, in the grand sense, the pandemic is not an accident. I know that sounds weird. I mean, it's not a scientific statement, but it's not an accident. It's all part of this, as I think social unrest is. And I worry.
Geoffrey, thank you. I want to try to get one last question in if there's time. Sorry, Captain, did you have a follow-up? I apologize. Okay. Mustafa, can you close this out with one last question?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask about the connectors between the networks. That's important to either accelerate or slow down the G or the mu, depending on if it's an ID or a pandemic. But can you talk a little bit about what do we know in terms of similarities of how can we use these connectors in models or in real life to be able to either suppress or accelerate the G or the mu in our models?
Yeah. No, so I should have said at the very beginning, I sort of indicated it, that, this is sort of work in progress. I mean, I only started working and thinking about this beginning with the pandemic, like many people, refocused on different way of, a new critical problem. And and I started to think about the pandemic, and then I quickly realized, and this is hardly original with me, that there are many similarities to the transmission of ideas and, in fact, the way institutions work, society work, and so on. So, and I don't know the literature. I've learned a little bit the literature of epidemiology, but I do not know really the literature that's associated with this in terms of transmission of ideas. I am familiar with a lot of the data on it, the number of patents produced and innovative cities and so on, all the rest. But it does lead to exactly your question. Can you make this more serious, maybe adding more bells and whistles and so on, and actually use it as a tool in terms of enhancing things you want? Now, of course, advertising agencies and political parties intuitively understand this. I mean, they are the ones that know how to twiddle what I call G and nu. I mean, basically the two sort of dominant parameters. They intuitively know how to do it. And there is a lot of social network work having been done on analyzing, networks and changes of opinions and so on. And Myrta, our colleague, works on that. But I'm not familiar with any theoretical developments along these lines. So I'm actually, I'm not answering your question, of course, but I'm actually very excited. I got very excited, to tell you the truth. And this all happened in the last week, of putting in terms of ideas, of seeing, can you actually take this seriously? Can you actually push it beyond, the question of using it as an idea machine, so to speak. Can you use it to do something productive? And both in terms of, for companies, universities, and cities, in terms of, putting it in a richer framework. So it's sort of, it's one of those wonderful things that happens when you do research. You work on one thing and it stimulates something else. And it's, it's the way things work, of course. So I'm sorry, I'm not really answering your question. It's just simply that I very much appreciate the question, and it's something that I intend to be thinking about much more seriously.
No, thank you. Actually, I really appreciate the talk. So it's generating us very interesting ideas.
And by the way, it is at a minimum, and part of this talk, by the way, was to really show you details of things and so on, that to try to create a way of thinking and to stimulate ideas and create just a different way of thinking about the things, because everybody's thought about everything I talked about in some form or another. So it was just sort of putting things together and trying to stimulate some thinking, complementary thinking. Maybe that's the word I should use.
So unfortunately, we're at time, but I'm going to ask everyone to sort of thank Geoffrey again as best we can through the limitations of Zoom, but this has been outstandingly informative. Thank you, Geoffrey.
Thank you.
Before we fully break, I just want to turn it over to Casey Cox for a minute to let us know what's next in the series and some other virtual action programming in the near future. Casey?
Sure. But first, just want to let everyone know that we should have a recording of this talk up on the event page by the end of the day tomorrow. And if you want to hear more from Geoffrey on scaling laws and social networks in the time of COVID, the first episode of a two-part series was just posted last night on SFI's Complexity podcast. I want to remind Action members to register by Tuesday for next week's virtual topical meeting on assessing the promise of artificial intelligence, which is co-sponsored by Action member Goldman Sachs. The meeting will take place as a series of 1-hour conversations across 3 days, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of next week. We'll have Melanie Mitchell giving a talk based on her book, Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Humans, then Mike Price on characterizing the scaling of human organizations using AI. And finally, Michael Kearns will address mechanisms by which human biases are unintentionally encoded into algorithms, and will explore strategies and trade-offs of embedding social values in algorithms. And then coming up in July, we'll have our 6th talk in our COVID series. This will take place on July 9th with Stephanie Forrest. on complexity, privacy, and the pandemic. And later in the month, we'll have the next program in our sustainability series, the complexity of sustainability beyond the power grid, in which Seth Bloomsack will give a briefing on the insights that came out of a recent SFI science working group that he co-organized. And we'll announce our August programming early next month. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Geoffrey. And thank you, everyone, for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.